Man, this carousel at heavyweight is something else. What's good? It's Woog. We've got Joyce, 16 wins and 3 losses, taking on Filip Hrgovic, 17 wins and 1 loss. This fight is being viewed as a bit of a loser's bracket fight. Joyce has lost his last 3 of 4 fights, and Filip Hrgovic is coming off of that upset TKO loss against Daniel Dubois on that Queensberry versus Matchroom 5-on-5 Riyadh season fight card. And it's crazy when you think about how much changes, especially in the heavyweight division, in such a short period of time. It seems like it was only yesterday that Joyce was a mandatory for a title shot, as was Filip Hrgovic for the IBF title shot. Both of these guys were undefeated. Filip Hrgovic had the reputation of being an avoided fighter until he fought Zhilei Zhang in a really competitive fight that Filip Hrgovic got the nod and the win on. And then you had Joyce, who had upset Daniel Dubois, stopped him, was an undefeated fighter beating Carlos Takam, Christian Hammer, and then stopping Joseph Parker in the 11th round. That was probably Joyce's biggest achievement. He's the only person to stop Joseph Parker. So at this point, the juggernaut was looking phenomenal. That was until he ran up against Zhilei Zhang, who stopped him in the first fight, kind of bloated his face, messed up his eye, and that fight was stopped in the 6th round, and then in the rematch, put Joyce on the canvas face first with a beautiful, because Zhilei Zhang's a southpaw, beautiful counter right hook. He just sank Joyce, who previous to that seemed like he had an indestructible chin. That's why he was viewed as a juggernaut. It seemed like he could just walk through anything and continue to throw those pummeling shots. I mean, look at how he broke down and stopped Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker looked like he was fighting a nightmarish type of fight where, yes, Joseph Parker persisted well past where he could have been stopped. I mean, you could see how uncomfortable he was by like the 4th and 5th round, because he could get the better, or look like he got the better of an exchange in terms of how cleanly he landed with like an overhand right. But then you would see Joyce counter with like boom, boom, 2 clubbing shots to Parker's body, and you would see the body language of Joseph Parker changing, where you looked at that exchange, and although Parker landed more cleanly, Joyce looked like he was administering most of the punishment. So Joyce, again, was looking damn near indestructible until he gets knocked out, stopped in back-to-back fights against Zhilei Zhang. And these were fights that Joyce didn't have to take. Again, he was the mandatory, but he really risked it against somebody that dangerous, and he, I hate to say it, but he paid the price for taking that risk. Back-to-back fights. His career really hasn't been the same since. He came back and he beat Cash Ali, a much lesser fighter, stopping him in the 10th round, but Joyce didn't look as good as he used to look. And then he fights Derek Chisora, where he gets dropped in the late rounds, and he lost a unanimous decision against Derek Chisora. Like, it was a close fight. Watching it, I thought that it could have gone either way. But Derek Chisora, who, I mean, again, a couple of years ago, you would not have thought Derek Chisora would get a win against Joyce. But again, that's how much things change in a short period of time in the heavyweight division. I mean, look, after Zhilei Zhang stopped Joyce, it was Zhilei Zhang who was looking golden. That was until he lost a decision against Joseph Parker and then just got stopped by Ajit Kabayel. So even Zhilei Zhang, who kind of built a lot of his elite reputation against Joyce, isn't looking elite anymore. Joyce was building his elite reputation against the likes of Joseph Parker, isn't looking elite anymore. Joseph Parker, on the other hand, when he got stopped by Joyce, I thought that was the end of Joseph Parker's elite run. And since then, he's beaten Deontay Wilder, Zhilei Zhang, and most recently, Martin Bakole, after Bakole took the fight on short notice, very short notice. But yeah, it's just this carousel of activity, wins and losses. A beats B, B beats C, and then C beats A. That type of thing has been occurring at heavyweight. So again, Joyce versus Filip Hrgovic is kind of seen as a loser's bracket type of fight, where the loser of the fight is really on the outside looking in, and perhaps the winner of the fight is kind of back in the mix. And betting odds wise, they've got Filip Hrgovic as a minus 350 favorite. So they've got Joyce going off at a plus 300 underdog. I would say that that's about right. Like, if this, again, was a couple of years ago, it would be closer to 50-50. But since we've seen Joyce hit the canvas and get stopped and then get dropped and lose to Derek Chisora, yeah, Joyce is a 3-1 underdog. And these odds could be wider in favor of Filip Hrgovic if it wasn't for the way Hrgovic lost to Dubois. Hrgovic was just splashing Daniel Dubois with a bunch of clean right hands. Like, this was one of my favorite fights of 2020, 2024 or the end of 2023. Either way, Daniel Dubois entered the fight to Michael Jackson's Bad. It was just a very interesting entrance, given what Daniel Dubois' reputation was before the fight, especially before his redemption fight against Jarrell Big Baby Miller, when Daniel Dubois was kind of tagged with the reputation of being a bit of a quitter just because we've seen him lose via taking the knee against multiple opponents. Well, Daniel Dubois was no games, and he was not playing when he entered this ring against Filip Hrgovic. Hrgovic landed like a dozen clean right hands, and Daniel Dubois just would not be denied. And he made it clear early in the fight that he was willing to walk through hell to get to Filip Hrgovic. And it seemed like Hrgovic's psyche was impacted by that tenacity that Daniel Dubois showed that night. So it looked like Filip Hrgovic had a little bit of quit in him by the time they got into the 4th and 5th round. It looked like Filip Hrgovic thought that he was just going to land those shots and get Dubois out of there. When it was not the case, Filip Hrgovic looked like he had that, oh boy, type of energy. And the fight was stopped in the 8th round due to a cut. But I thought that actually did Hrgovic a favor because he was up against the ropes getting blasted. I feel like that cut was almost a convenient exit, and he seemed like he was a little bit relieved that the fight was stopped because it appeared that it was only going to get worse for him and Daniel Dubois. I mean, we've seen what he did to Anthony Joshua, and we've seen what he did to several other fighters. Daniel Dubois got extreme power, and he was increasingly just blasting Filip Hrgovic. So, yeah, I think that the way that Hrgovic lost is the reason why the odds aren't more lopsided in favor of Hrgovic. Otherwise, I could very easily see Hrgovic being like a 5-1, even 6-1 favorite because Joe Joyce's reputation has dropped that much. Hey, I just wanted to take a minute and provide some additional context on this Joyce versus Hrgovic fight and on the betting odds. And another reason why I think that the odds are closer than they should be given Joyce's recent losses. But first, thank you for making it this far. I'm sorry about the audio. I didn't discover until after recording that the mic was only like half plugged in, so you're getting all of this kind of background noise. So I'm glad that it's audible, but I'm sorry that it's not as clear or as crisp as when the mic is properly plugged in. So thank you for riding with me on this one. But in terms of Joyce versus Hrgovic and some of the additional context, Joe Joyce was double booked to fight two people, neither of which was Filip Hrgovic. He was supposed to fight Patrick Corte, a lower level fight, and that was supposed to be his kind of rehabilitation fight. And he was supposed to fight Dillian Whyte shortly after. So you know how Israel Madrimov was scheduled to fight Sergey Bohachuk, and then like a few weeks later was going to fight Virgil Ortiz Jr., and then he ended up pulling out of that first Bohachuk fight and kept the date with Virgil Ortiz? Well, shortly before Joe Joyce versus Patrick Corte was supposed to go down, Joe Joyce pulled out of that fight, but he kept the date with Dillian Whyte. Some days passed, and then Dillian Whyte pulls out of the fight with Joe Joyce. So Joyce pulls out of the Corte fight, then Dillian Whyte pulls out of the other Joe Joyce fight. Joe Joyce is without an opponent, and then enter Filip Hrgovic on like less than a month's notice. Like, I think that this one broke story-wise like in the beginning of March, like March 4th, it was announced that Dillian Whyte had to pull out of the Joe Joyce fight. So Filip Hrgovic became a late replacement. Again, I don't think that he's got nearly a full training camp. And so this one isn't even scheduled as a 12-rounder. This one's going to be a 10-rounder. And just keep in mind, we don't know where Filip Hrgovic's endurance, and even if he starts off well, say he's belting Joe Joyce, will Hrgovic be able to sustain that type of activity and durability, endurance into the middle and late rounds of a fight where, again, he is a late replacement for? No, this isn't like a few days out, but it's less than the ideal month and a half to 2 months that fighters normally have to prepare. We're talking about a month's worth of training camp, maybe even a little bit less for Filip Hrgovic. So something to keep in mind going into Joyce versus Hrgovic. But here we are. We've got Joe Joyce versus Filip Hrgovic. And both of these guys are a part of the same Olympic class. It was 2016 in Rio. Joe Joyce was a silver medalist, and Filip Hrgovic won the bronze that same Olympics. And, you know, just sizing them up, Filip Hrgovic should win this fight. He's the more technically sound fighter. He's the better boxer. Joe Joyce seemed to be a bit of an overachiever given, again, his granite chin and his very unusual, unorthodox style. Yes, he is an Olympian, an Olympic medalist, but he came to the sport late. So he was never the quickest fighter. He was always very slow looking, even though, I mean, the guy was doing flip cartwheels. He was obviously an athlete, and he's obviously very talented. But just in terms of the snappiness of his punches, hand speed wise, or any sort of a trunk movement or punch evasion, Joe Joyce was never that guy. He would just walk down his opponents and just keep on throwing those clubbing shots until they couldn't take it anymore. Yes, he does have a space-filling, pummeling jab when he gets it going. I haven't seen too much of that jab in recent fights, but when he was at his best, he had a good jab, close the distance, use his big frame to get leverage into those clubbing shots, and again, he would work his opponent over. Whereas Filip Hrgovic is the more technically sound, sweet science guy who could throw that long right hand with some snappiness. Does have a, I would say he had slightly better defense, but it didn't look to be the case when he fought Daniel Dubois. Daniel Dubois was able to get to him repeatedly once he was able to walk through Filip Hrgovic's shots. But on paper, Filip Hrgovic should be blasting Joe Joyce from long range. Yes, we did see Hrgovic get dropped against Zhilei Zhang, and we saw that fight end up being a very tedious and kind of a battle of attrition. And Zhilei Zhang, we know, doesn't have the greatest endurance. So maybe there is something to, if you can make Filip Hrgovic work a lot and bring him into the late rounds, that it starts taking a toll on him. And we do know that Joe Joyce has a lot of durability, at least traditionally. I don't think his chin is where it was. But you usually don't see Joe Joyce looking like he's just exhausted in there. Although, again, I think Derek Chisora won most of the late rounds against Joe Joyce. But if Filip Hrgovic is still Filip Hrgovic, I think that he should be able to land those shots from the outside. And because of Joe Joyce's diminished punch absorption, there's a decent likelihood that Filip Hrgovic can hurt Joe Joyce, even in the early to middle rounds. Like, I wouldn't be totally surprised if Hrgovic blows Joe Joyce out. Now, if Joe Joyce can walk through those first several right hands and can bring this into like the 5th and 6th round, then we might have an interesting fight where it becomes a question of whether Joe Joyce can then start to break Filip Hrgovic. Again, if Joe Joyce can turn the page, because he's not a young fighter either, he's 39 years old, but if he could turn the page and give us that vintage juggernaut and pull out one of those performances, I can see him breaking Filip Hrgovic, especially if his chin is able to hold up. I just have big questions on whether it is able to. Again, Derek Chisora dropped him, and Zhilei Zhang made him faceplant. I'm going to go with the larger likelihood being that Filip Hrgovic, with his long, accurate shots, is going to hurt Joe Joyce, probably drop him, but I think Joe Joyce is going to get back up, and once he gets up, does Filip Hrgovic continue to pour it on, and does Joe Joyce stay hurt to where he's not able to take the fire and he ends up getting stopped by Filip Hrgovic? Or can Joe Joyce recover well enough to at least hang in there and fight it out with Filip Hrgovic over the course of 10 rounds? Because this isn't a 12-rounder, it's a 10-rounder. So I think that Joe Joyce is going to be able to recover from the moments where he gets hurt by Filip Hrgovic, but I think that Hrgovic is still going to put enough punches together and it's going to be able to kind of keep Joe Joyce out of his face enough where he doesn't get worked over and broken by Joyce. I'm going to go with Filip Hrgovic here. I think that he's, again, is a more accurate puncher, snappier puncher. I think he's going to have more success at range, and I think that he's going to be able to do enough to stop from Joe Joyce looking like vintage juggernaut against Hrgovic. Now, if this ends up being a fun fight, then I can't wait to see it, because, again, if Joe Joyce can survive the early rounds and getting hit cleanly and bring this out, yes, it could get very interesting, and I think that he will get blasted early, very cleanly. I think that he might get a little bit rocked early, but I think that he's going to eventually overcome that. I think he is going to bring it into the middle and late rounds, but I still don't think that he could do enough, moment by moment, punch for punch, to hang with Filip Hrgovic, who will, in different moments, look like he's just teeing off, I'm sure, against Joe Joyce. But I think Joe Joyce will make it the distance. I was very tempted to go Filip Hrgovic via stoppage, but this is a 10-rounder. I think that Joe Joyce is going to make it the distance. And again, Filip Hrgovic, I'm not sure where his head is either. Like, he loses a lot of tough points from me based on what we saw Daniel Dubois pull out of him when they fought. Like, look, if Daniel Dubois' performances earned him, fairly or unfairly, the reputation of being a quitter. I think that we have to kind of look at Filip Hrgovic with a lot of skepticism as well. Now, who knows? He might just close that chapter, turn a new leaf, and he might go on to have a great career, even a Hall of Fame career. If he could win a title, hold on to it, win, multiple belts, who knows? The story's still being written on Filip Hrgovic, but right now, as it stands, he's got some explaining to do. But I think he's going to do enough to beat Joyce via decision here. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this one. Isn't it crazy how much reputations changed in the blink of an eye? Again, especially in the heavyweight division, really in any division. Like, look at Errol Spence, and it's sad that, he's been a pound-for-pound fighter, a multi-belt holder for years at welterweight, but the first thing people are going to remember, a lot of people are going to remember about Errol Spence is that loss to Terrence Crawford. Boxing is just a cold game like that, unfortunately. But hopefully over time, that reputation gets corrected and you start remembering all the wins and him beating a prime or near prime Kell Brook and Sean Porter and all of that. But with these guys in particular, if you look at where their reputations were a year to 2 years ago versus right now, it's night and day. So again, we'll see who walks away from this one the winner. Look, I also wouldn't be totally surprised by a draw if Joyce is able to get to Filip Hrgovic and it ends up being a battle of attrition, similar to how Zhilei Zhang and Filip Hrgovic ended up being a bit of a slog when you got into the later rounds. Joyce, if he gets going and he senses that you're breaking, he's going to start coming and with near reckless abandon. It would be interesting if we get there, but I don't think Joyce is going to make it that competitive, but he'll do enough to make it the full 10 rounds. So yeah, I'm going Filip Hrgovic via decision. Probably a unanimous decision. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.